This is the Moonlight Graham Show, a freewheeling conversation with the role players, the underdogs, and guys with flat-out great stories in sports.
Hello and welcome back to the Moonlight Graham Show, where we celebrate the role players and the underdogs in sports. And today on our episode, we're going to talk about multi-sport athletes. A couple reasons why I wanted to talk about multi-sport athletes today. First and foremost, Bo Jackson and Deion Sanders may be the most famous and most successful multi-sport athletes of my lifetime, are both back in the news right now. Deion Sanders just took the Colorado Buffaloes head coaching job in football, and a new book by Jeff Pearlman just came out about Bo Jackson, and I just got done reading it about 4 days ago. And like most people, after they get done reading a book, all they want to talk about is the book that they just got done reading, and I'm no different. So our episode today is about multi-sport athletes. And the other reason why I want to focus on multi-sport athletes today is because we are in an era of sport specialization. And kids nowadays seem to be picking a sport. Probably their parents are forcing them to pick a sport earlier and earlier. So kids are specializing in just one sport way too early, and it actually is limiting their potential to find the sport that they're going to be best at and that's best suited for them to excel, because they're specializing in a sport at 8 years old, 10 years old, 12, 14 years old. And most boys aren't actually reaching full potential until they're 18, 19 years old. So they don't really know how good they're going to be at that sport when they're 8, 10, 12 years old. What it's doing is it's limiting kids' potential in the sport that they choose, number one. And number two, it's keeping us from having great athletes play multiple sports. If you look back on the last 100 years of sports history, you had guys like Jim Thorpe and Jackie Robinson and Jim Brown and Bo Jackson and Deion Sanders. And the list goes on and on of these great athletes that played not one sports, not two sports, sometimes even 3 or 4 sports in college. And I know nowadays, because of sports specialization, you do have better competition in sports at an earlier age than ever before. But my argument will always be that kids can learn more from playing other sports, and they actually become better athletes by doing so. One of the benefits that I always found from playing multiple sports is it's always good not only to move your body in different ways and test it competitively in different sports, but sometimes the value of playing multi-sports is simply humility. Like I remember when I was a high school baseball player, my senior year, I was a pretty good high school baseball player. And I hit over 400 and I won, about every game I pitched. I would strike out 15 guys and I would win the game. Now, I also played cross country, or I ran cross country, and I was the man on the baseball field, but on the cross country team, I was our fourth runner, third runner, fourth runner. And sometimes it was a good lesson for me to get my butt kicked by other kids in different sports that I kicked their butt on the baseball field, and they kicked my butt on the track or in football or in cross country. It was a lot different. And I think that is a good lesson for kids they don't have to be the man all the time. And it teaches them the importance of different roles on the team. You can be the starting quarterback, you can be the point guard, but sometimes it's good to be the second runner on a 4x8 too. And you learn a lot from not always being the best on the team. And you learn a lot about being maybe the third or the fourth best guy, or what it takes to be a role player, what it takes to be an underdog, instead of just trying to lean into things that you're good at all the time. So I think as kids get older, it's important to not only lean into the things that you're good at, but it's also good to try other sports that you may not be the best at, because you're going to find something different within yourself. And you're going to challenge yourself in different ways when you're out of your comfort zone and maybe out of your number one sport. So to talk here about sport specialization and multi-sport athletes, I'm bringing on the king of multi-sports today, Neil Flattery. Neil, when you think of multi-sports, are Bo Jackson and Deion Sanders the guys that you think of, or who else comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Tim. I think we were talking a lot about this a little bit earlier, and I think it's kind of important to group these guys into different categories. So you have Bo Jackson and Deion Sanders, and And those guys specifically are maybe on a different kind of, you have a different label on them because they were literally playing both professional sports at the same exact time. So those are the first two guys that I think of. But for me, kind of, I didn't really grow up in that era of, there was kind of an era that we'll maybe get into a little bit later of like the 80s and 90s. And I know that if you go back 50 years or so, there were guys playing several different sports, but specifically that era, you had like the biggest name athletes playing, or at least a few of the biggest name athletes playing multiple sports at a high level at that stage. And so that was a little bit before my time a little bit. And so like, I've been kind of growing up in this era of more sports specialization, that type of thing. But like those guys specifically were kind of like the prototypical guys of, and we don't even we kind of forget about how good they were at both sports. I'm thinking specifically of Deion Sanders and Bo Jackson too.
What did you think of my take about playing multiple sports and not always being the best? Like, you might be the man on the basketball court, but it's good to play another sport where you have to play a different role and have a different, spot on the team.
Yeah. I like that take because I was trying to think of, because sometimes I see this argument get made online, and I think the focus is too much on like it seems like everyone's on board with there's too much sports specialization in sports right now. Everyone's on board with that, but they're almost making the point like you're going to be the best basketball player ever by playing 3 different sports. And I don't always think that that's the case necessarily. Like, it's, a lot of times I think kids you have time to play basketball in the winter and in the summer, and also play baseball. You just have more time than maybe you realize. But I think the better point is just playing multiple sports is just going to make you a more well-rounded person because you're going to have different experiences. You're going to put yourself with different types of people. Not everyone is going to be playing college sports, and that's okay. Not everyone's meant to play college sports, but playing more sports when you're young is just going to make you a more well-rounded person. I think that's the most important point.
And it's also going to allow you to be coached by a lot of different people and coached in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
Like, you're going to be coached. That's one thing I loved about high school is the basketball was pretty intense at the school that we went to. And I loved that. I loved that we took basketball seriously, and, Coach K coached us hard. Baseball, on the other hand, was a very relaxed sport in a much different environment. Football, of course, has its own culture around there. So the practices are different. The culture is different. The intensity during a game day or during a practice is much different. Track and field, cross country, they have their own culture. And I think it's good to experience all of that as an athlete, because if you're ever going to coach kids, if you're ever going to coach your kids, or if you're going to, move on to college, you have to figure out, like, how do I like to be coached? How do I want to coach other kids instead of just trying to mimic that one coach in that one sport that you had?
Yeah, that's a good point. It was something I always enjoyed, specifically like when you play football, you get a chance it's the basketball players and the wrestlers playing together. And then basketball is maybe your own little small group of guys. Then you go run track and you get the cross country guys with the guys from all the other sports. And then you got your baseball team too, which is kind of a collection of characters too. So I think just giving your opportunity to get to know a bunch of different people is helpful too. And I think of it specifically like kids who are playing more like, individually minded sports at a young age, I think is maybe not always the way to go. Like, specifically some of these sports, you don't need to be specializing in track and field when you're in middle school and that type of thing. But I think we're both on the same page there.
So for today's episode, we're not going to rank the athletes. I think ranking the best multi-sport athletes, we'll talk about it a little bit. And I guess I will throw out my ranking of the top 5, but I'm not going to rank the top 100 or the top 25 because it's almost impossible to do when you're weighing multiple sports, the difficulty of it, and multiple careers. And there's been literally hundreds of guys that have played professionally in multi-sports. The other thing is, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about old time multi-sport athletes. And I know Jim Thorpe, people argue he's the greatest athlete of all time. That was like 100 years ago. I'm not here to talk about that. So we're going to talk about like the modern era, really in the, think past World War II, past color television, the Super Bowl era, if you will, because if you look back like the 1940s and 50s, basically all the best athletes were playing both professional baseball and professional football, and some even played professional basketball at the same time. So we're going to talk about like the modern era, mostly our lifetime here. But I want to clarify too, there is a big difference when I'm talking about like the best multi-sport athletes. I am limiting that to guys that played two professional sports. Not to say that some of these guys couldn't have played two professional sports, but I am drawing that line of distinction here because there was so many guys that played professionally in one sport, but were also known for another college sport, but they never actually played that other sport professionally.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good distinction, Tim.
So to that point, I guess the best of, not to interrupt you, Neil, but the best of the rest, like the best of the guys that only played one professional sport that probably could have played but two were, and these are guys that I think we all know. So who I'm talking about there is number one, Charlie Ward, who won the Heisman Trophy, but played 10 years in the NBA after that. Todd Helton, who of course played quarterback at Tennessee. Peyton Manning took his job, and then he's going to be a Hall of Famer in baseball. You had Dave Winfield, drafted in 3 sports, only played professionally 1. Joe Mauer, Tom Glavine, Kirk Gibson, Carl Crawford, Tom Brady, Jackie Robinson, played 4 sports, Jim Brown, another one. Tony Gwynn, Kenny Lofton were great college point guards as well as baseball players. Dan Marino, Kyler Murray, Steph Curry, who's played a couple of like web.com golf events. Pat Connaughton, I think in the modern era would be the closest guy to having a chance to play in both the NBA and the MLB because he was a first round draft pick in baseball. Then you had Jeff Samardzija, Ryan Miner, Chris Young, Antonio Gates, Tony Gonzalez, Ronald Curry, Julius Peppers, Jameis Winston, Donovan McNabb, and Tony Clark. Those are my best of the guys that only played one sport professionally, but were also well known to play 2 sports. Did I miss anybody there, Neil?
I can't think of anyone, Tim. It'll be interesting to see if any of those guys like Jameis Winston or some of those guys, Pat Connaughton, if they flame out here pretty soon, if they try to give baseball a shot.
I know. I'm always curious if that's going to happen, similar to what Tebow did with baseball. So
right.
I'm going to run through my list of like the modern multi-sport athletes. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pick 5 to 10 of them that we want to talk specifically about their careers. So the modern multi-sport athletes, here's my list. John Lynch, Hall of Fame football player, also played 2 years as a baseball pitcher in the minor leagues. Russell Wilson, famously 2 baseball seasons, still playing as an NFL quarterback. Tim Tebow, of course, won a playoff game as an NFL quarterback, had a 4-year baseball career. Then, of course, you have Deion Sanders, Bo Jackson, Brian Jordan, John Elway, Shaq Thompson, Chris Wenke, Ricky Williams. People forget that Ricky Williams played 4 years of minor league baseball while also becoming the NCAA rushing champion. DJ Dozier, who was one of the only guys in the modern era to play in both the NFL and Major League Baseball. Then you had Chad Hutchinson, Drew Henson, Matt Kinzer, Danny Ainge, Mark Hendrickson, Ron Reed, Josh Booty. Neil, fun fact about Josh Booty, he played in the major leagues, was on NFL rosters for 3 years, but never played in a game. So he would be on that short list of guys to play in both the major leagues and the NFL, but he never actually appeared in the NBA or in the NFL, excuse me. Scotty Burrell and Michael Jordan. Yes, that's right. 2 guys from the 1996 Bulls, both played minor league baseball and in the NBA. And famously, remember in the Last Dance documentary, Jordan was just ruthless on Scott Burrell. And I wonder if it's because like Jordan was slightly jealous at that time of like Scott Burrell's baseball career. I don't know. Just a thought.
Yeah, interesting.
Lolo Jones. So bobsledder and track and field athlete. Very, very impressive. Olympics in both sports. Herschel Walker, Olympic bobsledder, along with the NFL, along with college track too. Bullet Bob Hayes, Marquise Goodwin. Both those guys were Olympic track athletes along with the NFL. Then you had James Jett, who won a gold medal in the 4x1, along with being a wide receiver in the NFL. Marion Jones, famous doper, Olympian, and also played 2 years in the NBA, WNBA. Then you have Mookie Betts, who's a professional bowler, along with baseball player. And then John Smoltz, who's played some professional golf, along with his Hall of Fame baseball career. Okay, that is a long list. We're not going to talk about every one of them. Neil, who's the first multi-sport athlete whose career you want to dive into?
Okay. Yeah. The only other one I would add is there was this Olympic sprinter, that Devin Allen, who had a shot with the Eagles during preseason but got cut. He was maybe like a gold. I can't remember if he's a gold or silver medalist in the hurdles. And I thought he would make it on the team, but he got cut. But that was the only other guy I would add. So the first guy, I and we don't need to talk about him in all that much length, but Russell Wilson's a guy that comes to mind as, a high profile baseball player in the modern age. Within the last 15 years, he's still a current NFL player. And he's kind of a guy that I want to target because he's a guy that played 3 years of baseball in college at NC State, then went to Wisconsin. Wisconsin doesn't even have a baseball team, so he didn't play baseball that year. But then he does go and plays a couple years in the minors. Was he playing in the minors during when he was at Wisconsin?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So he's a guy I almost want to use him as a baseline because, you look at his minor league stats, they're not all that great. And they almost kind of compare well to some of these other guys we're going to talk about, like Michael Jordan and Tim Tebow, because his stats aren't all that great. And he just got done playing, a full 3 years of college baseball. He played 2 years in A-ball, batted about the 220s, pretty average.
Yeah, to that point, I think he only played 2 years of college baseball and then played during his last year at NC State and his only year at Wisconsin. I think that's right.
Okay. I thought
well, go ahead. You might be right. Maybe I missed that. Regardless, he played 2 years of minor league baseball, and he is the guy that actually, even after he was an NFL quarterback, major league teams continued to pick him up. And he would come, remember he would go to the Rockies, and then he was with the Yankees and the Rangers, and he would go to spring training and do 2 weeks of spring training with the baseball team. Part of it was a media showcase for sure. But Russell Wilson was always doing that, maybe I'm going to give up football and play baseball thing for multiple years while he was an NFL quarterback. And he was using it as a negotiating tool. And to your point, looking at his numbers, granted, this guy is a premier athlete, but he was not a prospect. He hit 230 his first year in low A. And then his next year in A ball, not even high A, he hit 228 with almost no power. He had a decent on base percentage his second year in pro ball. And he had, decent stolen base numbers, but really Russell Wilson's baseball numbers, especially for a guy who had 2 years of college baseball, high level college baseball under his belt, weren't good. He was not going to make the major leagues in baseball.
Yeah, exactly. And even that, I think he's also an example of a guy that, because the NFL, there's just so much more money in the NFL now than maybe there was 30 or 40 years ago, that when he was doing these minor league appearances during the offseason to try to use that as leverage against NFL teams, it was kind of viewed as ridiculous at the time because he's made so much money as an NFL quarterback that it has never really been worth its while to rough it in the minors for a few years to try to make a major league team.
Yeah. So I think we're on the same page there, but to your point, everybody bags on the next guy I want to talk about, Timmy Tebow. Everybody bags on Tim Tebow's career. And yet Tim Tebow had his second to last year of baseball when he spent a full year in Double-A. That was leaps and bounds better than any baseball season Russell Wilson ever had. Now, granted, when Tim Tebow got signed, and if you remember the baseball tryout that he had, it looked bad. It looked really bad. He was trying to catch plot flies. It looked terrible. He was so muscle bound that he was just ripping out of the uniform. His throwing motion has never been pretty. We know that from the football field. But he looked like a beast in the box. And you're like, I don't know. He looks more like a slow pitch softball player than a baseball player. But if he can hit the ball 500 feet, somebody's got to be willing to take a chance on him. The interesting thing about Tebow is he did not play college baseball. I don't believe he even played baseball his senior year of high school. So then 10 years go by and he goes back and starts playing professional baseball after not playing for 10 years. It seemed so ridiculous. And yet, Tebow's third year of professional baseball in Double-A, which is really, really high level baseball, guys, like where all the prospects go. Russell Wilson never even made it to Double-A. Tim Tebow in Double-A hit 270 with a 336 on base percentage, had 21 extra base hits that season. And you thought, holy cow, if Tebow keeps getting better, he's going to be in the big leagues. And I remember the day he signed, I said the odds of Tim Tebow ever even making it to AAA are 0. And he proved me wrong. He made it. He spent a whole season in AAA. And at that moment, during his Double-A season, when he was hitting 270 and was a Double-A all-star, I thought, I think Tim Tebow's going to make the major leagues. I think he's going to get a call up. Now, granted, his next year in AAA was a disaster. And he hit under 200 and looked completely overmatched and never really excelled past that. But I mean, that's what 99% of minor league baseball players do. And he was just right in that mix.
Yeah, Tim. And I think when Tebow was going through the minors, we were like the preeminent Tebow defenders online, or at least on Twitter, among our 300 followers. But, I think I would say, like, I'd only caveat Tebow in the sense that, like, you look at his numbers, and if his name wasn't Tim Tebow, like, I wouldn't look at him and be like, that's a star prospect that we have. But just the fact that he hit 270 with, a 734 OPS, which is like a solid, pretty solid OPS in Double-A, makes his baseball stint a success in my eyes. But, like, I think the sad thing about Tebow was, like, kind of what you put, like, you looked at him in the outfield and it was just like, he looked so lumbery and his arm was terrible. And, like, he never looked like he could be a legitimate NFL or a, major league starting outfielder. And, if you're not going to be an okay defensive outfielder, then you really got to hit. And he didn't really have those numbers. But anyways, like, we're on board. We're on the same page. Tebow's baseball career was a success.
But to that point, he didn't look all that different than like what Kyle Schwarber looked like in the outfield his first year in the outfield. Remember how bad that was?
Yeah, that's true.
Now Schwarber's like a decent left fielder. But granted, Tebow, I don't think ever looked good. I don't think he ever looked like he got better. And I think that probably goes to taking 10 years off from playing baseball.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just that sole fact. If he would have batted, if he had his stats were 75% of what his stats were, I still think that would be successful for taking 10 years off of baseball.
Right. I don't think Tim Tebow's career was a mockery. And I think it's actually amazing what he did, considering all things considered. All right. That wraps up the bow on Tim Tebow. Neil, who's next on your list that you want to talk about?
Okay. So the only guy I wanted to bring up too, and I only wanted to bring him up because I think he's an example of, maybe a guy that you would look at and maybe he should have maybe specialized. So this Drew Henson's a guy who he's a quarterback at Michigan, famously was at Michigan at the same time as Tom Brady. And, he had a couple of years in the NFL, and he also had a couple of years playing for, I believe, the Yankees in the majors. But it never really panned out on either way. And so I almost look at him as a guy as like, could you look at him and be like, maybe Drew Henson's a guy that should have specialized in some sport, maybe not when he's 12, but maybe a little bit earlier so that you could utilize his athletic ability, spend more time specializing in one sport. I'm not saying that's what he should have done. I'm just trying to play devil's advocate and say, is he a guy that maybe that's the route he should have taken?
Right. And you're probably a little too young for this, but Drew Henson might have been a victim of like the Sports Illustrated curse, right? So he was on the cover of Sports Illustrated when he was in high school because he was the all-time high school home run king at that time before James Peterson and Jeff Clement broke his record. And so he's on the cover of Sports Illustrated as the number one football and baseball prospect in the country. And of course, George Steinbrenner Yankees, first round pick, signs for over $1 million, and at the same time goes to Michigan to be the starting quarterback. And the whole time he's at Michigan, it was always that back and forth with Brady thing going. And you could always tell like there's a lot of potential there. He's got a strong arm, but he just never, like, he was always platooning. Then after Michigan, I think I've got this right. He actually gives up football for a while and plays baseball, ends up making it up to the major leagues, actually has a couple of really, really good minor league seasons where it looks like, okay, this guy is really going to hit his potential here for the Yankees and be the next third baseman, the next Greg Nettles for the next 20 years, But then he ends up kind of flaming out in AAA, gets a call up, goes 1 for 9 in the major leagues, and then decides, well, maybe I'll give football another shot. And of course, he goes basically from the Yankees of baseball to the Yankees of football in the Dallas Cowboys and Jerry Jones, and I believe starts maybe 3 or 4 games for the Cowboys as their starting quarterback. But to your point, Neil, it just was never panned out in either sport, and maybe there's some potential loss there.
Yeah, I think that's true. And it's still just the fact that he was able to have some success in both sports is pretty exceptional. Also keeping in mind he was able to do 2 sports and being one of the few white guys that we're going to talk about today too.
All right. So let's get maybe to the top 2. Let's talk about Bo and Dion. I want to talk a little bit more about Bo and Dion, maybe the two best dual sport athletes ever. And before we talk about each one of their careers, there's this era of time in the late 80s to the early 90s, from like 1988 to 1992, where you actually have 4 guys essentially playing Major League Baseball and in the NFL at the exact same time. Now, not all of them overlapped at the exact same time, but this was a movement. All 4 of them were black guys. So I wonder if any of it of like, black guys not playing baseball as much anymore. I wonder if this is like a product of that. Like if we had more African-American guys playing baseball today, would we see more dual athlete or dual sports guys? Because in the early 90s, you had, of course, Bo Jackson and Deion Sanders, who were doing it at the exact same time. But then you also had Brian Jordan, who played 3 NFL seasons. And as soon as he got through the minor leagues in 1991, he had 3 NFL seasons under his belt. He saw that in 1992, he was going to spend most of the major league season in baseball with the Cardinals. And he gave up football to play baseball, where he played the next 15 years of his career in the major leagues. Then you also had DJ Dozier, who was an NFL running back for 4 years and played about 15 games for the New York Mets. But at one time in the early 90s, you essentially had 4 dudes, Bo Jackson, Deion Sanders, Brian Jordan, and DJ Dozier, that were playing 2 sports at the same time. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it is. And we've kind of touched on this a little bit before too. And it's like, I wonder if it almost seems like it's coinciding, Tim, with the period in time when the NFL was reaching the MLB in terms of popularity and starting to surpass it. And so there was a period of time when you had these 2 sports that were really competing against each other as what is the most popular sport in America. And it's not one of them really held the crown like maybe the NFL does today, and maybe the MLB did 20 years before. And so you have these guys that, you can't really, there isn't maybe the money in the NFL as there was with the MLB at that time. So it made more financial sense to play both sports, but it also made made sense for them as far as just like, gaining notoriety and that type of thing, because you had these 2 sports that were both in similar terms of popularity. And so it seems like at that point in time, you had that now in the NFL has kind of passed the MLB in terms of popularity since then.
Right. And it can't go without saying that it was also a time where college sports were true amateur sports. And so these kids weren't getting the NIL deals. They weren't getting the monthly stipends for clothes, the monthly stipends for housing that kids get now, and even pre-NIL were getting. So these kids were true amateurs. So you saw more guys sign professional baseball for that signing bonus out of high school and also go to non-SEC schools to play college football. And so you saw that a lot. And that's where a lot of this list comes from. Take a guy like Ricky Williams that played 4 years of football at Texas and all the while was playing minor league baseball at that time because he could sign a $100,000 deal for baseball, but also be playing college sport and be considered amateur in that other sport. And to your point, that guaranteed money in baseball at that time, because of the popularity, it was really viewed like there's more money, more guaranteed money in baseball. Nowadays, because of the popularity of football and also basketball contracts, those two sports have almost surpassed what you can get from baseball.
Yeah. And I think this also kind of circles back. I thought you made a good point earlier, Tim, when you talked about sports specialization, because sometimes I think that the discussion around sports specialization, in my mind, sometimes gets ridiculous when you pull up the NFL draft and be like, look at the top 10 picks in the NFL draft. These guys all played 3 sports. Well, it's like, of course, these guys played 3 sports in high school. They're 6'4", can run a 4.4 40 and jump out of the gym. Like they of course, like can get by playing 4 sports. But like, I thought the point you made earlier about like, you need to play multiple sports because you don't know what your best sport is till maybe you're later on in life when your body is fully matured. And you look at some of these guys like Brian Jordan and Bo Jackson. Bo Jackson could have still played at a high level in baseball and football, but Brian Jordan specifically, he maybe didn't know that baseball was his best sport or had the most opportunity for him till he was like 24 years old.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the amount of like white kids that are under 6'6" that specialize in basketball when they're 14 years old drives me crazy. Like, you've got no future, kid. And I don't want to crash a bunch of dreams here, but maybe try a different sport because you could have a lot more potential in another sport if it's not basketball. Now, I love basketball more than anything, but like, there's just not a lot of high end future for like white kids that are under 6'6" in hoops. And even like 6'6" white kids, you know, you're playing D3 ball. No offense to D3 ball, but like, is it worth 12 years of travel teams and thousands of dollars to go pay for your own education in Division III?
Right. I mean, you know, I think in some sense it's like playing a lot of basketball is fun because playing basketball is fun, but it's like you still do have time to play basketball almost year round and also play multiple sports. People just have more time in their lives than I think they realize too.
All right. So Bo Jackson, let's talk about Bo Jackson. Now, Bo was incredible and just got done reading that book by Perlman. And it's a fantastic book. I think I've read about every one of Jeff Perlman's books at this point. One of the most interesting things about Bo Jackson that I learned from the book is that we're talking about multi-sports at sports for all these reasons that are like high and mighty, right? For competitive nature and for, you know, testing yourself in different sports and getting coached differently. Bo Jackson played multiple sports just so he didn't have to practice the other sport in the off season. Like, Bo Jackson didn't even like football. And so he would play baseball in the off season, and he actually liked baseball way better because he didn't like the meatheadness and the intensity of football. And he didn't want to have to like lift weights in the off season. So he played baseball, and vice versa. He didn't really like, you know, working on his swing and taking thousands and thousands of cuts in baseball. So he just played football because he could just, you know, take the handoff and run.
Yeah, I think that's funny too. You know, he's the one guy that like he can get away with that because he just had these God-given gifts that no one else, literally no one else on the planet has. But it also is refreshing to see a guy that just like, he just loves to play sports. And that's really what it's all about too. It's funny just to see him. He just like wants to play sports, doesn't want to practice. He just likes going out on the field and playing.
Yeah. And all the while, like, he was running track as well. You know, and Dion was doing the same thing. Dion was playing 3 sports at Florida State. Bo was playing 3 sports at Auburn. Herschel Walker was running track and playing football at Georgia. At the same time, Bo was playing 3 sports at Auburn. It's just incredible. And Bo Jackson in that book, I mean, the guy's literally, I don't know if we've ever seen another guy like him. In pads, ran a 4.19 40 in pads on grass. They didn't believe him, so he did it again in 4.17 in pads and on grass.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah. And so Bo Jackson's baseball career, obviously he's more well-known as a football player because of the popularity of football, number one, and number two, because of Tecmo Super Bowl. The legend of Bo Jackson is what it is because of Tecmo Super Bowl and the Bo Knows Nike campaign and the famous poster with Bo Jackson in shoulder pads with the baseball bat across his shoulders, right? It's the greatest marketing campaign, that's a non-Jordan marketing campaign essentially ever. And that's really why he's so famous. But that isn't to take away from how amazing he was. So first of all, Bo Jackson played 9 total baseball seasons. He missed basically 2 seasons because of injury, and he played 1 year in the minor leagues before that. So he played a grand total of, 694 Major League Baseball games. So actually more than probably what people think. And he hit 141 home runs. So if you're keeping score at home, Joe Mauer played in like 2,000 Major League Baseball games and hit 148 home runs. Bo Jackson played 694 games and hit 141 home runs. 3 of those seasons too are after the hip injury when he was essentially playing on one leg. In his last 2 years, he had a fake hip. I think he's the only guy ever to play in the major leagues with a fake hip. So like what he was doing was really incredible. But for a 2-year stretch, Neil, from 1989 through like 1990, Bo Jackson in 1989 was the MVP of the MLB All-Star Game. During that baseball season, he hit 32 home runs, drove in 105 RBIs, and was the MVP of the All-Star Game. In that same football season, he was second team All-Pro, and made a Pro Bowl. And then he goes back after that football season where he was a Pro Bowler. And in the 1990 baseball season, he hits 28 home runs, really has his best baseball year. Hit 272, 342 on base percentage, hit 28 home runs, had another great baseball season, goes back to football and has another Pro Bowl year. In that 2-year span, he was, the greatest athlete the modern era has ever seen.
Yeah, those 2 years there that you highlight are just incredible too. And you forget how good of a baseball player he really was. And I think he even referred to it. His baseball career was his football career. He said was his side job or his what he did on the off, his hobby. That's right. His hobby. Yeah. I mean that 1989, 1990 stretch, we'll never see another athlete do that thing again.
Right. Okay. So Deion now. Now, Deion, of course, is a Hall of Fame football player. So Bo got hurt, right? Bo has this degenerative hip issue, and it ends up biting him in the butt, and it basically ruins his football career. He has to never play football again. He ends up coming back for that, playing for the White Sox for 2 seasons, and then the California Angels for his last season. And it's kind of sad, like how athletic Bo was. And then after the hip injury, he was just a shell of himself because he was playing with a fake hip. Now, Deion probably never hit the heights that Bo did in baseball, and Bo could have been a Mike Trout, a Mickey Mantle type baseball player. He was that good. And you could really see from watching him, like he was starting to get it in baseball. And if he would have just played baseball and he didn't have the hip injury, I think Bo Jackson probably is a Hall of Fame baseball player today. Deion probably was never going to be a Hall of Fame baseball player, but he was really, really good. He was in that like Kenny Lofton type class. And even though Deion wasn't the same type of baseball player that Bo was, Deion played in almost the same amount of games as Bo. He played for a total of 9 seasons, similar to Bo, 641 games, was a career 263 hitter, 320 on base percentage, stole almost 200 bases. Only guy ever to play in both a Super Bowl and a World Series. And in the World Series that Deion played in, he absolutely tore it up. Like he was an absolute marvel. maybe my favorite thing about Deion's baseball career, other than he comes up with the Yankees, he starts to really shine, and he's playing for both the Falcons and the Braves in Atlanta at the same time. But what I love about Deion is he took years off and still came back to baseball. So like in 1995, after he gets traded to the Giants, he, I think, was dealing with an injury and took the 1996 baseball season off. And then he comes back to baseball in 1997, playing for the Cincinnati Reds, hits 273, 329 on base percentage, steals 56 bases after taking a year off. Then after that season, takes 2 more seasons off, the 1998 and 1999 season, comes back in 2000 and doesn't play in the major leagues in 2000, just plays in AAA. And you'd think like a guy with Deion Sanders' ego and prime time and Neon Deion and all that, like you'd think Deion would be like, hell no, am I playing in the minor leagues? He was playing in AAA baseball at the age of 32 and then still comes back at the age of 33 after not being in the majors essentially since 1997 and plays for Cincinnati again as a 33-year-old and retires after that last season at the age of 33. So I love that about Deion. And this goes back to my point about playing multiple sports because it can teach you humility. Like Deion was really humbled throughout his baseball career, and he didn't hang him up because he was a Hall of Fame football player and he was the greatest defensive back we've probably ever seen. And he was just one of the guys, and teammates all loved him in that clubhouse, in that dugout in baseball. And because of that, like I'm forever a Deion Sanders fan.
Yeah, and I was pretty amazed looking at Deion Sanders' baseball statistics specifically, because I think just the fact that he had such a successful and long NFL career, I think overshadows just how good of a baseball player he was. And I think he played in an era where, as you had mentioned, like speed was more important. So he was able to swipe bags and bunt to get hits and that sort of thing too. But I was just looking at so Deion Sanders made $33 million playing football, a little bit over that, in 14 seasons. In baseball, he still made over $13 million playing baseball. So about a third of his total earnings came from playing baseball, which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah. So in my rankings, and it's hard to rank these dual sport athletes, Deion's my number one. Would you agree with that, Neil? In the modern
I would agree with that. Mm-hmm.
And Bo's my number two.
Yeah, and I think just the sole fact of Deion's longevity in both sports just gives him the edge. Even though maybe his peak in both sports wasn't at Bo's peak, I think he's still got to give Deion the edge because of that.
Well, Deion's football peak was higher than Bo's peak for sure.
Yeah. I mean, maybe Bo had. Well, yeah, I don't have Bo's football numbers, but maybe Bo had like instances in football games where he was the best football player in the world, but he never really maybe put together all the stats for it.
Yeah. Bo had some highlights that were just as memorable as Deion's highlights. And that's kind of the critique of Bo as a football player, is that he truly treated it as a hobby. He didn't lift his weights. He didn't learn the playbook. He essentially was just like, give me the ball and I'm going to run people over. I'm going to run away from them. But because of that, because he didn't know the playbook, it actually led to a lot of broken plays and a lot of like negative yardage plays because Bo ran the wrong way.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And because of that, also, some of those broken plays turned into like 92-yard touchdowns for Bo because he was so athletic that he could make a broken play a touchdown. But it frustrated some of his teammates who were grinding it out for 12 months a year. And Bo just shows up 4 games into the football season and is already better than half the team. And a couple weeks later is essentially the best player in football.
Yeah. It's funny because I think that like the popular imagination has Bo Jackson as the number one dual sport athlete ever, but people for whatever reason forget that Deion Sanders' career was as good as it was.
Right. Yeah. Deion is just so famous as a football player.
Yeah.
So a point that I want to draw here, Neil, from Deion Sanders. So we're talking about how great of a career Deion Sanders had. But I want to point out that after Deion Sanders, after his 1997 season with Cincinnati, where he probably had maybe his best year ever, hit 273, stole 56 bases, just a really, really good baseball season. He takes the next 2 years off. And then in that 2000 year, he spends the whole year in AAA. And by the whole year, the whole season for him, which was like 44 games. Mm-hmm. The reason I bring it up is because Michael Jordan, he had his only baseball season at that same age Deion was at. So Deion at that time, after he took 2 years off and came back to baseball at the age of 32 to AAA, hit 200 with a on base percentage of 292. Okay. So that was Deion Sanders at 32 years old after taking 2 years off from baseball. And Michael Jordan, after taking 15 years off from baseball in his only minor league baseball season, hit 202 and had a 290 on base percentage. So essentially Michael Jordan's numbers in AA after taking 15 years off from baseball, he hadn't played since he was 17 years old, picked the sport up again at 32 years old. His minor league numbers are almost the exact same as Deion Sanders' minor league numbers after taking 2 seasons off from baseball in AAA. So if you look at it from that perspective, Neil, Michael Jordan's career looks pretty good in retrospect.
Yeah, and wasn't Michael Jordan's stats like, if you look at the second half of the year versus the first half of the year, he was maybe batting like, he maybe batted like 260 or 250 or 260 in the second half versus he just got off to a terrible start at the beginning of the year too. And then he had a really good fall league too before the strike started. So I just think there's not really a good argument for Michael Jordan being just like this complete failure of a baseball player.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And, you know, the Jordan Rides the Bus 30 for 30, I think did a good job of laying this all out. Michael Jordan in spring training and in April and in May was not a good baseball player. He was a 6'6" basketball player who hadn't played baseball in 15 years, trying to go up against AA competition. And that's really, 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 really hard to do. Like impossibly hard to do for those that don't know what that level of competition actually is like. The second half of the year, Michael Jordan hit 260 in AA. He stole 30 bases. He started driving the ball. And if you look, I went back and looked at a ton of quotes from guys like Terry Ryan and, you know, former GM of the Twins and, you know, just baseball guys across baseball. When they saw Michael Jordan at the Arizona Fall League after the minor league season where Jordan hit 252 in the Arizona Fall League, they said, this guy's going to be a major leaguer. He looks like a prospect. The guy that we saw 3 months ago is not even close to the guy that we see now. And Jordan got better and better every month that he played, to the point that during the second half of that season, he looked like he was going to be a Major League Baseball player. And so I think what Michael Jordan did, not playing baseball for 15 years and then just picking up the game in AA, is one of the most incredible athletic accomplishments I could ever dream of. I mean, you look at what Russell Wilson did. Russell Wilson played 2 years of high-level college baseball, never even made it to AA. Jordan hit 260 the second half of the season in AA and stole 30 bases. That's amazing. It's amazing what he did.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of what's interesting about the conversation we're having now is it's kind of like an exercise you do when you talk about the greatest athletes in the world. If like, you know, if you put LeBron as an NFL tight end, how would he do? And so like in the 80s and 90s, we have these examples of the greatest athletes in the world trying their hand at these other sports. And, you know, for a lot of guys like Michael Jordan and some of these other great athletes, like they maybe weren't at the top of their game at these other sports, but they tried it and it was exceptional it was exceptional seeing what they were able to do on such limited, you know, just using their God-given athletic ability and not having like all the greatest, you know, amount of time practicing and all that sort of thing.
Right. So that leads me to the number 3 guy on my list. So if I had a top 5, Dion's number one, Bo's number two. My number three is probably going to surprise some people because it's Danny Ainge. Danny Ainge is the number three guy on my list. So obviously, baseball and football are the two easiest multi-sport things to do because their seasons do not overlap. But basketball and baseball, it's almost impossible to do because the seasons naturally overlap. Like the basketball season is getting done after the baseball season has started. And Danny Ainge, so I went through that Bo Jackson run, right? Where he was through 89 through 91 with Bo Jackson was like the greatest 2-year run that any athlete has ever seen. But Danny Ainge in 1981 is a very, very impressive year as well. So in 1981, Neil, Danny Ainge is the Wooden Award winner in college basketball. Okay. So that goes to the best college basketball player. Danny Ainge averaged 24 points a game for BYU in 1981. He famously led BYU, had a buzzer beater in the NCAA tournament, and they made a run in the NCAA tournament. That ends in March, right? He gets done with playing college basketball, and then he goes right to being the starting third baseman for the Toronto Blue Jays. Danny Ainge, while he was the best player in college basketball, was also the starting third baseman for the Toronto Blue Jays. So for the last 3 years that Danny Ainge was playing at BYU, he was a major league baseball player. Most of these guys that we're talking about of their college careers overlapping with their pro careers, it's when they're playing minor league baseball. Danny Ainge in 1979 was the youngest player in Major League Baseball and was also a sophomore at BYU. So Danny Ainge wins the Wooden Award in basketball and then goes and plays 86 games as a starting third baseman for the Toronto Blue Jays that same year. So he gets done with March Madness. He goes and picks up right to Major League Baseball, where granted his baseball stats are not very good. Like he hit 237 in 1979 as a 20-year-old. He was actually in the major leagues at 19, was the youngest guy in the major leagues. Hit 243 the next year, actually showed some promise that next year, and then 187 that year in 1981 after winning the Wooden Award. But you got to remember, like, he's not playing baseball in the offseason. He's playing basketball in the offseason. So Danny Ainge hangs him up after 3 Major League Baseball seasons where he plays 211 career Major League games, hits 2 home runs, 19 doubles, not great numbers, but he played in the major leagues. That same year then, Neil, 1981, he plays for the Boston Celtics. So he starts 1981 as the best player in college basketball. During the middle months of 1981, he's playing third base for the Toronto Blue Jays. And in the fall of 1981, after baseball season's over, he goes right to the Boston Celtics, where he's on the same team as Tiny Archibald and Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, Robert Parrish. They get beat by the 76ers in the Eastern Conference Final that year. Danny Ainge played 53 games on that team, all in that 1981-1982 season. That all happened in one 12-month run. He won the Wooden Award. He played 80 games for the Blue Jays, and then he played 53 games for the Celtics, all within 12 months. That is something we will never, ever see again.
Yeah, that's crazy, Tim. I was going to say, I before you outline just kind of the whole backstory of his MLB career, just looking at the total production in baseball, I would have had probably the next guy on your list ahead of Danny Ainge, Brian Jordan, just because you look at his NFL career and you look at his baseball career, his football career is better than Danny Ainge's baseball career, and Brian Jordan's baseball career is probably similar to Danny Ainge's basketball career. But just the fact that backstory of what Danny Ainge had to go through when he was playing in the majors maybe puts him ahead of Brian Jordan.
Yeah, I love that. I love that fact because Danny Ainge, I think in hindsight, people remember him as, just looking like a Mormon pretty boy, right? Like he was in that
Yeah.
John Stockton, Jeff Hornacek, pretty boy type of thing. But he was a ruthless competitor and just an incredible natural athlete.
Yeah, and it's kind of just like and also a glimpse of a different era too. Like that type of giving a guy like that the opportunity to play multiple sports at such a young age like that would just never happen today.
I met Danny Ainge 2 years ago in the a friend of ours, sponsor of the pod, Matt Adams, People's Company. We were taking a plane. We were taking a plane from the Des Moines airport on the private plane side of things. We're waiting for our plane, and Danny Ainge walks in. And as we're all walking out to the plane, we're walking out the door, and Danny Ainge in Des Moines, Iowa, is holding the door open for us. And he's looking at us, and I spotted Danny Ainge right away. Nobody else knew. It was like, hey, that's Danny Ainge. He's opening the door for us, and he walks out. He goes, what are you guys doing? Because we looked like a bunch of knuckleheads who were pretty excited to be on a private plane. And we said, we're just flying to South Dakota for a steak dinner, which is exactly what we were doing. And Danny Ainge goes, must be some steak dinner. And he was right.
So were you on the same plane as him?
We were not on the same plane. They were stopping to refuel.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Yeah. So Danny Ainge is my number 3 guy on my list. Brian Jordan, I said I wasn't going to rank them, and here I am ranking them. Brian Jordan's my number 4. And to your point, Neil, Brian Jordan, when he was 22 years old, 23 years old, 24 years old, was the starting strong safety for the Atlanta Falcons. And he was good. The last 2 years in the NFL, he started every game, picked off 5 passes, was a hard-hitting, good, strong safety. At that same time, was playing minor league baseball. And then when he turned 25, he saw that his future was going to be in baseball. And he didn't have to put his body through all that abuse in football. And he spends the next 15 years from age 24 through 39 in the major leagues, where he ends up having 1,454 career hits, 184 career home runs, career 282 hitter, 333 on base percentage, a really, really great Major League Baseball career. I don't know why I have Danny Ainge ahead of Brian Jordan now that I'm thinking of it. I think it's mostly because of that 1981 year that Ainge had, and also the fact that Danny Ainge won NBA titles. But maybe I should have Brian Jordan ahead of Danny Ainge.
Yeah, and it's funny because I don't know why we don't talk about Brian Jordan more as being this exception, a guy who was able to do multiple sports and that sort of thing. I think, I hate to say it, but it's almost because his more prominent sport was baseball. Is that the reason why we're not having more Brian Jordan conversations? Because he was able to do, not necessarily what Dion did, but similar to that. He maybe wasn't the star in one of the sports that those other guys were too, and maybe that's part of it.
Well, and to my point earlier, he was doing it at the exact same time as Bo and Dion.
Yeah, that's true.
If he was doing it 10 years later, he probably would have had his own marketing campaign.
Yeah, I mean, he may have been a little bit later than them. Just a few years though. But at that point too, it's Brian Jordan is just like a poor man's Deion Sanders at this point. So why would we have a Brian Jordan conversation then?
Right. So the 5th guy. So to round out my top 5, and I've got Dion number 1, Bo number 2, Danny Ainge number 3, Brian Jordan number 4. My 5th guy is probably going to surprise some people because he's another NBA/MLB player, and it's Mark Hendrickson. So Mark Hendrickson, left-handed pitcher, 6'10", 6'11", played 4 years in the NBA. He played 4 years in the NBA. And at the same time he was playing in the NBA, I don't even know how you do this because the seasons overlap, but he was playing in the minor leagues while he was playing in the NBA. And then basically as soon as he hit the major leagues for baseball, gave up basketball. So he played from 1996 to 2000 in the NBA, playing for Phoenix, Sacramento, Cleveland, and the Nets, played 114 NBA games, career NBA earnings. Let's look it up. $734,000. Way to go, Mark Hendrickson. But then he goes on to play 15 professional baseball seasons after that and has a really great baseball career. And once again, like totally overlooked when it comes to dual sport athletes, but more people need to be talking about Mark Hendrickson.
Yeah, made $10 million playing baseball too. So that's pretty good. I forgot about him, or like I recognize the name, but I had to Google. I didn't realize he played basketball too. That's incredible. I didn't realize he should get bonus points too in your rankings for being able to play basketball and baseball.
Yeah, I mean, he pitched in 328 Major League Baseball games after having an NBA career. It's just remarkable.
Yeah, that's crazy.
All right, Neil. So that's my top 5. So I got Hendrickson 5, Brian Jordan 4, Ainge, Bo, Dion. What other multi-sport athletes do we need to talk about?
Well, the only other guy I think we need to mention is Wilt Chamberlain, just because I think it's not even necessarily because like the two sports you would think about with Wilt Chamberlain is the fact that like he had this exceptional NBA career and then he retired and basically had another like Hall of Fame volleyball career. And it's not even so much that like it's not super surprising to me that like Wilt Chamberlain could go as a 7'1" player and be like a really good volleyball player too. I think it just kind of speaks to like he was living in that era where like I don't know how much money he playing NBA, but it probably wasn't a whole lot. So it's almost like he needed to play another sport too, just to like have another job when he got done with playing basketball. But I think it's also, you look at Wilt Chamberlain and he's like the original, they talk about this in the NBA now, like these unicorn players who are just like these guys who can do everything and they're just, extremely tall and athletic. And Wilt Chamberlain was all of that. Like you look at some of his track times, he used to run track too. And he'd run a 49-second 400-meter dash, jump 22 feet in the long jump. Just like throw the shot put 53 feet. I think he has, I'm seeing on Google here too. I don't know if this is true, but it says that Wilt Chamberlain owns the highest vertical jump in NBA history of 40. He had a 48-inch vertical. And so I don't think we talk about necessarily just like, not necessarily of how good of a basketball player he was, just like the fact that he was just like this incredible athlete that I don't think, maybe we will never see again. Maybe in the same realm of a Bo Jackson.
Right. Yeah. Bo Jackson. Maybe I sped through Bo Jackson too quick because his track and field career is unbelievable. When he was in high school, Bo Jackson, because he didn't like to run the mile, would be up in the decathlon by so much after 9 events, even in the state decathlon, that he didn't participate in the mile, which is the last event of the decathlon. Like Bo Jackson set the state record for the decathlon and he only competed in 9 events.
Yeah, and that's funny too, because it's like the decathlon you got to throw like the javelin and all these like random events too. And so just to see, I mean, I still think it's incredible. Wilt Chamberlain, as a 7'1" guy, had a 48-inch vertical and ran a sub 50-second 400.
But Wilt Chamberlain broke 2 minutes in the 800.
He ran a 158. I'm seeing.
Yeah, that's what I saw too. That's a girl. Bo high jumped 6'8" at 240 pounds.
Yeah, that's incredible.
I mean, like it's just like superhuman. I don't even know how that happens.
Yeah. It's funny how these guys used to, I don't know if it's funny is the right word, but like these guys were just so like willing to just try their hand at all these different sports. Like, do you even see that anymore? Like, what are LeBron's track times or Devin Booker? Like, you think that these exceptional athletes would still be like awesome at track too, but you don't even see them doing that sport.
I know. Yeah. So, well, that wraps up our multi-sport. The only other thing, I guess, to wrap things up is I like, tying in a local tie to the end of these episodes in this season. And Brody Brecht over at Iowa is a guy that is doing 2 sports at Iowa. Now, granted, I don't think he'll ever play two sports professionally because his ceiling in baseball seems to be so much higher than his ceiling in football. But he's a guy that throws 101 miles an hour off the mound and, is a starting wide receiver for the University of Iowa right now. I don't think he's ever going to like reach high, peaks as a receiver, especially at Iowa. No offense, Hawk fans. But he's doing it. Like he's keeping the multi-sport dream alive.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And we need to be more supportive of him too. Like I've seen a lot of guys would be like, well, he needs to just focus on baseball because he can get so much more money playing baseball. And that's probably true, but like it's cool to see a guy try his hand at another sport too.
Here's one, maybe to go at a fellow podcaster. Connor McCaffrey was a two-sport guy at Iowa too. But is Connor McCaffrey the guy that focused on the wrong sport? Because his best sport coming into Iowa was for sure baseball. And then basically all the injuries that he had in basketball really hurt his baseball career. And obviously he's spending more time in college playing basketball than baseball. And essentially his baseball career ended abruptly. Now, I don't know the ins and outs of Connor McCaffrey's baseball career, but I had always heard during his early years that, he had a chance to be a pretty good pro prospect in baseball. And obviously he, no offense to Connor McCaffrey's game, but like was never going to be an NBA type of guy in basketball.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Like he might be a guy that chose the wrong sport, but
basketball is way more college basketball is way more popular than college baseball. So I get that.
Right.
And
he gets to play for his dad and his brother and all that stuff too.
All right, Neil.
All right. Well, thanks for having me back, Tim. I appreciate it.
It's good to see you.
See ya.
It's Moonlight Graham, yeah. It's a pretty good program, broadcasting to the heartland. Sports stories for the everyman. It's Moonlight Graham, yeah. Please follow us on Instagram. You're loving us on Twitter too. You download every pod we do. It's Moonlight Graham.